the man who set out to destroy the early church, wrote half of what would become the New Testament. He never met Jesus during his earthly life. He met him on a road in the desert, after the crucifixion, in a vision that left Saul blind for 3 days. By the end of his own life he had walked and sailed across the Roman Empire. He had planted churches from Cyprus to Greece to Italy. He had been beaten, stoned, shipwrecked, jailed, and finally beheaded outside Rome. His 13 letters became the architecture of Christian theology for the next 2,000 years. This is the deep dive of Saul of Tarsus, who became Paul the Apostle. Saul was born around the year 5 of the Common Era, in the city of Tarsus, in the Roman province of Cilicia. Tarsus sat on the southern coast of what is now Turkey, on a major trade route between the Aegean and the Euphrates. It was a cosmopolitan city. Greek philosophers, Roman administrators, Jewish merchants, Syrian traders. Saul was born a Roman citizen, a status his father had somehow acquired and passed down. That single fact would later save his life more than once. Roman citizens could not be flogged or crucified without trial. They had the right of appeal to Caesar himself. His family were observant Jews, Pharisees devoted to the law of Moses. They taught Saul a trade, as all Jewish fathers were expected to. He learned tent making, stitching together silicium, the rough goat hair fabric the region was famous for. He would keep that trade his whole life. It supported him on the road. He would not take money from the churches he founded. When Saul reached the age for formal religious education, his family sent him to Jerusalem. The journey from Tarsus to Jerusalem was about 600 miles. He was placed in the school of the most respected rabbi of the age, Gamaliel. Gamaliel was the grandson of the great Hillel, founder of the moderate school of Pharisaic thought. To sit at the feet of Gamaliel was the equivalent of training at Oxford or Harvard today. Saul was a star pupil. He later wrote that he advanced in Judaism beyond many of his own age. He was zealous for the traditions of his fathers. He memorized scripture. He debated. He became a Pharisee of the strictest kind, blameless under the law as he understood it. This was the world he lived in. Judea under Roman occupation. The temple in Jerusalem stood as the religious and economic heart of the Jewish nation. The Sanhedrin, the Jewish council of elders, ran daily religious life under Roman tolerance. Several Jewish factions argued over how to live under empire. The Sadducees ran the temple and cooperated with Rome. The Pharisees taught synagogue Judaism and waited for the Messiah. The Zealots wanted armed revolt. The Essenes withdrew into desert communities. And then a new sect appeared, the followers of a Galilean teacher named Jesus. Their leader had been crucified by the Romans under the prefect Pontius Pilate. His followers claimed he had risen from the dead and was the long-awaited Messiah. To Saul, this was blasphemy. A failed revolutionary worshipped as God. The Pharisaic establishment moved to crush the movement before it spread. The first Christian martyr was not Jesus himself, but a man named Stephen. Stephen was a Hellenist Jew, one of 7 deacons appointed to serve the early Jerusalem church. He preached in the synagogues of Greek-speaking Jews. He performed wonders. He was dragged before the Sanhedrin on charges of speaking against the temple. His defense, recorded in the 7th chapter of Acts, was a sweeping retelling of Israel's history. He accused the council of murdering the Messiah, just as their fathers had killed the prophets. The council exploded in rage. They dragged him outside the city walls. The witnesses laid their cloaks at the feet of a young man named Saul, who watched as they stoned Stephen to death. Saul approved of Stephen's execution. It was the beginning of his own career as a persecutor. He began going from house to house in Jerusalem, dragging believers, men and women, out and into prison. The persecution scattered Christians across Judea, Samaria, and beyond. Many fled north to the great city of Damascus, where a community of believers had taken root. Saul went to the high priest. He requested letters of authority. He would travel to Damascus, find every Christian there, and bring them back to Jerusalem in chains. The road from Jerusalem to Damascus was about 135 miles, a journey of roughly 6 days on foot, with horse for the leaders. He set out with a small armed escort. He was perhaps 25 years old. The year was around 34 of the Common Era, maybe 35. Christianity, as we would later call it, was barely 3 years old. On the 6th day near the city of Damascus, around noon, something happened. A light brighter than the noon sun flashed around him. He fell to the ground. The men with him also fell or stood paralyzed. Saul heard a voice in Aramaic speaking his name. "Saul, why do you persecute me?" He answered, "Who are you, Lord?" The voice said, "I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. It is hard for you to kick against the goads." The image was rural. A goad was a sharpened stick used to drive an ox. An ox that kicked back only injured itself. Saul was that ox. The Acts of the Apostles records this moment 3 different times. Once in chapter 9, narrated by Luke. Once in chapter 22, told by Paul to a Jerusalem crowd. And once in chapter 26, told by Paul to King Agrippa in Caesarea. The 3 accounts differ slightly. In one, the companions hear the voice. In another, they hear only sound. In one, they see no figure. In another, they see only the light. Scholars have debated these variations for centuries. Most accept them as different perspectives on the same event. Saul got to his feet. When he opened his eyes, he could see nothing. The light had left him blind. His companions led him by the hand into Damascus. He was taken to a house on a street called Straight, owned by a man named Judas. For 3 days he could not see. He did not eat. He did not drink. In Damascus there was a disciple of the new sect, a man named Ananias. The Lord appeared to him in a vision. "Ananias, go to the street called Straight, at the house of Judas. Ask for a man of Tarsus named Saul. He is praying." Ananias protested, "Lord, I have heard about this man, the harm he has done to your saints in Jerusalem. He has authority from the chief priests to arrest everyone who calls on your name." The Lord said, "Go. He is a chosen instrument of mine. He will carry my name before the Gentiles, before kings, and before the children of Israel. I will show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake." Ananias went. He laid his hands on Saul. He said, "Brother Saul." Something like scales fell from Saul's eyes. He could see again. He was baptized. He ate. His strength returned. And then, almost immediately, he began preaching in the synagogues of Damascus. He preached the same gospel he had come to destroy, that Jesus was the Son of God. The Jewish community of Damascus was confused, then outraged. The man they had been told was coming to arrest the Christians had joined them. A plot was formed to kill him. They watched the city gates day and night to seize him. The Christians, the very people he had come to arrest, now had to lower him over the city wall in a basket. He escaped into the desert. Here the book of Acts becomes vague. Paul himself fills in the gap in his letter to the Galatians. He says he did not go to Jerusalem to consult with the apostles. He went into Arabia, the kingdom of the Nabateans, the desert tribes south and east of Damascus. He stayed there 3 years. We do not know what he did. He may have preached. He may have wrestled with the meaning of what had happened to him. He may simply have hidden, processing the most violent reversal a human mind can undergo. After 3 years, he returned to Damascus. He started preaching again, and then he went to Jerusalem for the first time as a Christian. The disciples were terrified of him. They did not believe his conversion was real. Barnabas, a Cypriot Jew who had become an early believer, brought him to the apostles. He testified that Saul had truly seen the Lord on the road and was preaching the gospel. Saul spent 15 days in Jerusalem with Peter, and also met James, the brother of Jesus. But the Hellenist Jews in Jerusalem, the same circle Stephen had preached to, plotted to kill Saul too. The believers smuggled him out of Jerusalem and sent him back to Tarsus. He disappears from the historical record for nearly 10 years. We do not know what he did in those years. They are called the silent years, or the hidden years. He may have founded churches in Cilicia. He may have continued his tent-making. He may have written, or studied, or simply waited. Meanwhile, the gospel was spreading. In the great city of Antioch in Syria, a mixed community formed. For the first time, Jewish and Gentile believers worshiped together, ate together. The new movement needed teachers. Barnabas, working in Antioch, remembered Saul. He traveled to Tarsus to find him, and brought him to Antioch. For a year they taught the church together. It was in Antioch that the disciples were first called Christians. Outsiders started calling the believers Christianoi, the followers of Christ, the Christians. Around the year 46, the Antioch church commissioned Barnabas and Saul for a mission. They sailed from the port of Seleucia to the island of Cyprus, Barnabas's home. They preached across the island. The Roman proconsul Sergius Paulus believed and was baptized. It was around this time that Saul started using his Roman name, Paul. From Cyprus they sailed to the southern coast of Asia Minor. At Pisidian Antioch, Paul preached in the synagogue. Many believed. The local leaders ran them out of the city. At Iconium, more believers, more opposition. Another expulsion. At Lystra, Paul healed a lame man. The local crowd, speaking Lycaonian, thought he and Barnabas were gods. Paul barely stopped them from sacrificing oxen to him and Barnabas. And then enemies from Antioch and Iconium arrived. The same crowd that had hailed him turned. They stoned him, dragged his body outside the city, and left him for dead. The disciples gathered around him. He got up and went back into the city. The next day he and Barnabas left for Derbe. They eventually returned to Antioch in Syria, having planted churches across what is now southern Turkey. A few years later, around the year 50, a council was held in Jerusalem. The question: did Gentile converts have to be circumcised and follow the full Mosaic law? Some Jewish Christians said yes. Paul and Barnabas said no. The Jerusalem leaders, including Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, met to decide. Peter spoke for letting the Gentiles in without the full law. James proposed a compromise. Gentiles would abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from strangled animals, and from sexual immorality. The decision opened Christianity to the wider Roman world. It is one of the most consequential meetings in religious history. Without it, Christianity might have remained a small Jewish sect. Not long after, Paul and Peter clashed at Antioch. Peter had been eating with the Gentile Christians, sharing meals freely. Then a delegation arrived from James in Jerusalem. Peter withdrew. He would no longer eat with the Gentiles. Other Jewish Christians followed him. Even Barnabas, Paul's partner, joined the withdrawal. Paul confronted Peter publicly. He accused him of hypocrisy. If you, who are a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force Gentiles to live like Jews? We do not know exactly how the argument ended. Paul records it in Galatians as a victory, but it cost him his partnership with Barnabas. They separated over a related dispute. Paul took a new companion, Silas, and set out on a second missionary journey. They traveled overland through Asia Minor, revisiting the churches Paul had planted. At Lystra, they picked up a young man named Timothy, who would become Paul's closest disciple. They wanted to preach in Bithynia. Paul wrote later that the Spirit forbade them. They came to the port of Troas, on the coast of the Aegean Sea. There Paul had a vision, a man of Macedonia calling, "Come over and help us." The next morning they sailed to Greece. It was the first crossing of Christianity from Asia into Europe. At Philippi, a Roman colony, Paul preached by a river to a group of women. The first European convert was a wealthy woman named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. Paul cast a spirit of divination out of a slave girl. Her owners, who profited from her fortune-telling, dragged Paul and Silas before the magistrates. They were stripped, beaten with rods, and thrown into the inner prison with their feet in stocks. At midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing. An earthquake shook the prison. The doors opened, the chains fell off. The jailer, thinking the prisoners had escaped, drew his sword to kill himself. Paul stopped him. "We are all still here." The jailer and his household were baptized that same night. In the morning, the magistrates released them. Paul demanded a Roman apology for beating an uncondemned citizen. They moved on to Thessalonica, then Berea, fleeing mobs each time. Paul came alone to Athens, the philosophical capital of the ancient world. He was provoked by the city's many idols. He preached in the marketplace. The Epicurean and Stoic philosophers heard him. They brought him to the Areopagus, the council of judges. On the rock of Ares, beneath the Acropolis, Paul gave one of the most famous speeches in religious history. He had seen an altar in the city inscribed, "To an unknown God." This God, he said, was the one he came to proclaim, the creator of all nations. He quoted their own poets. "In him we live and move and have our being." Some mocked. Some said, "We will hear you again on this." A few believed. He moved on to Corinth, a wealthy port city on the Isthmus of Greece. There he met two Jewish tent makers, Aquila and Priscilla, expelled from Rome by Claudius. They became his partners and his closest friends. Paul stayed in Corinth a year and a half, the longest single stop of his ministry so far. He wrote his first surviving letter from Corinth to the church at Thessalonica. The first letter to the Thessalonians is the earliest book of the New Testament. It was written around the year 51, almost 20 years before the Gospels. From Corinth he sailed back to Antioch. The second journey was over. The third journey began around the year 54. He went overland again, then settled in Ephesus, the capital of the Roman province of Asia. For 2 to 3 years he taught daily in the hall of Tyrannus. Converts grew. New magic books were burned publicly in the marketplace. The silversmiths of Ephesus made their living selling small statues of the goddess Artemis. The new faith was killing their business. A silversmith named Demetrius rallied the city against Paul. A mob filled the great theater of Ephesus chanting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," for 2 hours. Paul wanted to address the mob. His friends would not let him. The town clerk eventually calmed the crowd. Paul moved on. He traveled through Macedonia and Greece again, collecting an offering for the poor of Jerusalem. He felt drawn back to Jerusalem to deliver it personally. Friends warned him. Prophecies in city after city told him he would be arrested. He went anyway. At the temple in Jerusalem, a mob accused him of bringing Gentiles past the inner courts. They beat him. The Roman tribune of the garrison, hearing the riot, sent troops to rescue him. Paul was taken to the barracks. He asked permission to speak to the crowd. He told them his story. The conversion on the road. They listened until he said the word Gentiles. Then they exploded again. The tribune ordered him flogged to find out what he had done. Paul asked the centurion, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who has not been condemned?" The flogging stopped. The tribune himself came. "You are a Roman citizen." "I was born one," Paul said. He was held in protective custody in Caesarea, on the coast, for 2 years. The Roman governor Felix delayed his case, hoping for a bribe. A new governor, Festus, took over. He proposed sending Paul back to Jerusalem for trial. Paul appealed to Caesar. As a Roman citizen, that appeal had to be granted. King Agrippa II, visiting Festus, asked to hear him. Paul told his conversion story again. Agrippa said, "In a short time you would persuade me to be a Christian." He could have been released. But the appeal to Caesar had to be honored. He was sent to Rome. The voyage took place in the late sailing season, against the advice of an experienced sailor. A great storm caught the ship. They drifted for 14 days. The ship was wrecked off the island of Malta. All 276 aboard survived. Paul was bitten by a viper as they gathered firewood on the beach. He shook the snake off into the fire. The islanders, expecting him to die, eventually decided he must be a god. They wintered on Malta. In the spring, another ship took them to Italy. Paul arrived in Rome around the year 60. He was kept under house arrest for 2 years. He could receive visitors. He could write letters. The book of Acts ends here, with Paul in Rome, preaching to all who came to him. We do not know what happened next, with certainty. Tradition holds that he was released, traveled west, possibly to Spain, that he was arrested a second time during the persecution that followed the Great Fire of Rome in 64, that he was held in much harder conditions, and wrote his last letters from a cold Roman prison, that around the year 67 under the Emperor Nero, he was beheaded outside Rome on the Ostian Way. As a Roman citizen he could not be crucified. The sword was his legal right. Tradition says it happened on the same day Peter was crucified upside down in the city. The first Christian writer to mention his martyrdom is Clement of Rome, writing around the year 95. The early 4th century historian Eusebius confirms the tradition. A small basilica was eventually built over what was believed to be his grave on the Ostian Way. That basilica, expanded over the centuries, still stands. St. Paul outside the walls. Of the 27 books of the New Testament, 13 are attributed to Paul. His letters, written to the churches he founded, were preserved and circulated long before the Gospels were written down. Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon. Together they make up about a quarter of the New Testament, by word count, but their influence is far larger. They are the theological architecture of what became Orthodox Christianity: justification by faith, the doctrine of grace, the church as the body of Christ, the dissolving of the wall between Jew and Gentile inside the new community. Almost every major Christian thinker since has been arguing with Paul, or for Paul, or both. Augustine, Luther, Calvin, Wesley, Barth, the modern New Perspective school. A man who began by trying to extinguish a small Jewish sect ended up redefining it for the world. The persecutor became the architect. 2,000 years later, 2.5 billion people on earth identify as Christian. Most of them have read or heard a Paul letter, at least once in their lives. He never met the founder of his religion in person, but he kept writing in a Roman prison cell, until the sword fell. Was Paul's road moment a vision or a revelation? Tell us below. And always stay seeking.